Our next speaker is Dakota Hoska, and she is the Assistant Curator of Native Arts at the Denver Art Museum. And I want to thank J.R. Henneman for having introduced me to Dakota several years ago. We have had wonderful conversations and collaborations since then, and hopefully we have only just begun. I encourage you to read the bios of every speaker in this brochure. And one thing I will say, I've just learned that Denver was the first institution to collect Native arts as art. They will be celebrating their 100th anniversary of so doing in 2025. And so, anyway, what a wonderful person to have address the following. And, you know, the line, you had me at hello. This was, you had me at the title. Are we art or are we artists? Dakota Hoska.
I'm so laughing because I got this little fan group over here. I might need a taller mic. Haumatakeapi. Chante washtea na pechi uzapi. Dakota imakiapie. Lakota wiya he macha. Gavazi ahaha elomawapi. Hello, my relatives. I shake all of your hands with a good heart. My name's Dakota. I'm a Lakota woman, and I'm enrolled in the Pine Ridge Reservation. What you just heard is how we as Native people, especially Lakota people, are instructed to introduce ourselves. So it's a kind of protocol. It's kind of one of the first things that you learn when you're learning your language. And I wish I could remember more because it's really a case of use it or lose it. And it's a beautiful language, but I will share that with you. I want to tell you that I live and work in Denver, which is the homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and the Arapaho people, along with many other tribes who pass through that on their annual hunting, migrations, and as they moved camp. I want to say a special thank you to Lisa. I have so enjoyed getting to know her and come to this conference. And it's a weird fit, you know, and I just love that I can be here and represent in this place that I don't think a lot of Native people either see themselves or expect to be seen. And so it's just a really nice time to move things forward for me. And a special thank you to Erin Welsh, who does so much organizing, and my hotel, and my really kept everything together. It's a great conference, so thank you all for having me speak. Well, great care must be given to not get into a fight over who has been treated worst in a patriarchal, empirical system of dominance. I couldn't help but think, when Lisa asked me to speak at this conference, about the difference between the women who were excluded from displaying their artwork at the Centennial Exposition and the experience of Native people there and at other World's Fairs. Now, don't misunderstand me. I absolutely think it is wrong for one group to exclude 50% of their population, as happened at the Centennial Exposition. But there is a vast difference between not being able to show your art and having your body, your family, and your way of being put on display for the scorn and entertainment of others. Although, in all fairness, I know that's still happening to women today. The Centennial Exposition flouted the pain and suffering of Indigenous people by celebrating the birth and continuation of a country that had dealt deceptively, viciously, and rapaciously with them, denying their humanity and conceiving of their demise through the promotion of racial segregation and exoticized othering and marketed savagery, the latter stereotype used to justify their actions. When people arrived at the Centennial Exposition to celebrate this moment of supremacy and triumph, the experience for Native people was and had been very different. And it was a triumph, because before the 1876 Exposition, the fledgling United States was still regarded by the rest of the world as a backwards colony who recently suffered a civil war and presidential assassination. But after the Centennial International Exposition, no one would think of the United States as a hot mess again. Well, maybe today, but I digress. Unlike at the other World's Fairs, living Native people weren't shown there, but their artwork and material culture was indeed on display. Spencer F. Baird from the Smithsonian was the curator, and he was directed to not include live Indians. So that was good. He was also instructed to only include those items that didn't show any non-Native influence. And that was hard because, man, you guys were everywhere. The result was a floor-to-ceiling installation of curiosities that harkened back to the Wunderkammer approach. Additionally, there was no connection to the objects and their originating communities, meaning most of the maker's intentions or explanations of use went unaddressed. Lastly, and perhaps most unfortunately, was the installation of life-sized papier-mâché figures dressed in warrior clothing, which I assume means plains because we had the coolest stuff. But displayed holding what was described as primitive weapons. I'm not really sure what that was, spears maybe or something. This only served to reinforce a non-natives public preformed conceptions of Native people as primitive and inferior, as evidenced by this quote by William Dean Howell for the Atlantic Monthly. The red man, as he appears in effigy and in photograph in this collection, is a hideous demon whose malign traits can hardly inspire any emotions softer than abhorrence. In blaming our Indian agents for malfeasance in office, perhaps we do not sufficiently account for the demoralizing influence of merely beholding these false and pitiless savage faces. Moldy flour and corrupt beef must seem altogether too good for them. So this picture on the right is done by T.C. Cannon and just kind of documenting the sick cattle that were delivered to Fort Sill and how the women had to survive off using that to feed their families. To make matters even worse, on June 25th of 1876, just a month after the Centennial Exposition opened, the Battle of the Greasy Grass occurred. Some of you know it as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or as Custer's Last Stand. The bombastic account of the event in the New York Times only served to reinforce the disgust and prejudice of an already disenchanted public regarding Native American people. I bring all of this up because as we participate in these conversations about modernism, about stepping into a bright and new future, it is all too easy to forget that this movement into an optimistic and shiny future for some was devastating and came at a very steep price for others. And those others had to find ways to survive, either through participation or submission. Often, participation for Native people meant performing their indigeneity for non-Native audiences in efforts to promote diplomacy and understanding. While the Centennial Exposition incorporated mannequins to present Native people, there was an actual American Ethnological Museum at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, the first to put Native people on view for the observation of a non-Native public. Concurrently, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and his Congress of Rough Riders was in full swing. Although very different from the ethnological presentation of indigenous North American people, Buffalo Bill's shows still leaned heavily on the idea of spectacle, of Native people for the non-Native public. These shows attempted to educate, but I use that term pretty loosely, and entertain and that's more heavily, using promotional materials that encouraged customers to watch wild Indians acting their savage images. From then on, the American World's Fairs after Chicago incorporated their own Wild West shows and promoted them as major attractions. And even the government became involved in the show Indian trade, hoping to glean funding for the newly formed resident Indian schools, think boarding schools, by touting the before and after realities of the blanket Indians versus their uniformed and disciplined students from these government schools. And I kind of want to take a moment here to talk about what Adrienne said too. You know, you'll hear me using this term Indian in my paper, and that's because this is what the research materials were using from the time and like how people were described. But you know, I personally prefer I use the term native. Very rarely anymore, unless it's native to native, will you hear the term Indian tossed about. And in 1898, the Trans-Mississippian International Exposition in Omaha, Nebraska included more than 500 Native Americans from 28 different tribes, with a very famous participant, Apache chief Geronimo, who was a prisoner of war at that time, but who also drew huge crowds of tourists. Geronimo understood his draw and used this to his advantage, selling the buttons off his coat for 25 cents each, and then sewing new buttons on before meeting another group of tourists. At the St. Louis Exposition of 1904, model government school Native students, read assimilated, were placed in the center of a newly formed Indian Congress, which was actually an ethnological village comprised of indigenous people from around the world. There, the director of the St. Louis Indian School hoped to demonstrate that Indians are not normal in any sense, and that they are human. Indians are quite ordinarily endowed, physically, mentally, spiritually. They are not abnormal in any sense. Both boys and girls are well favored. They can talk. They can sing. They can learn. They are docile and obedient. They are human. Verily, the St. Louis Indian School may well be called a hall of revelation. However, while fascination with natives as an exotic, if unfortunate other, continued during these periods, at this point, native visual culture wasn't gleaning the same interest and was still classified firmly within the ethos of the ethnographic, and exhibited in varying degrees by mostly New York museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, American Museum of Natural History, and Brooklyn Museum, then the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. But that began to change, beginning in the 1910s. And so let's shift this talk slightly and move into how that happened and how Native art and artists became part of the modernist revolution. First, by setting the stage, then by inspiring, and finally by becoming the artists of this movement themselves. You all might know this, but I had to do a lot of work on modernism, so I hope this definition isn't too boring for you modernists out there. But according to the Tate Modern, modernism refers to a global movement in society and culture that from the early decades of the 20th century sought a new alignment with the experience and values of modern industrial life. Building on late 19th century precedents, artists around the world used new imagery, materials, and techniques to create artworks that they felt better reflected the realities and hopes of modern societies. Although many different styles are encompassed by the term, there are certain underlying principles that define modernist art. A rejection of history and conservative values, such as realistic depictions of subjects, innovation and experimentation with form with a tendency towards abstraction, and an emphasis on materials, techniques, and processes. Modernism has also been driven by various social and political agendas. These were often utopian in nature, and modernism was in general associated with ideal visions of human life and society and a belief in progress. This latter point regarding the social and political agendas, as well as the utopian vision for human life, is where we as Indigenous people enter into the picture. And I must note here that one thing that really became obvious to me as I prepared this presentation is the ironic duality of all the points that I'm hoping to make today. This duality is innate in the title. Are we art or are we the artists? Because many times we are indeed both, performing our nativity to gain inroads into economic systems of artistic and other forms of prosperity. But the ironic duality is also present in this point wherein, as industrialization overtook the fledgling United States, artists and others hungered for connection, community, and spirituality, things present in Native communities, but under attack by government policies and Euro-American settlers. Modernism in art was one of these new paradigms born of the love-hate relationship with the urban industrial world that is its natural home, and as a response to rapidly shifting changes in worldview. It was because of this longing for connection, community, and spirituality that Pueblo painters from the early 1900s began to have a broad appeal to modernist sensibilities, and were encouraged to create by well-meaning East Coast artists and socialites who hoped at first to help them preserve their cultures and experience some financial benefits, but whose efforts later morphed into innovation and adaptation on the part of the native artists. The earliest recorded Pueblo paintings on paper were made in 1900 at Hopi, Pueblo. 4 men were commissioned by Jesse Walter Fuchs from the Smithsonian Institution to paint pictures of their Katsinam, which you guys may know as Kachinas, which were embodiments of spirits according to their religion. Fuchs wanted to have the most aboriginal works possible, meaning those that possessed no hint of artistic instruction. This was because Fuchs was an ethnographer and he was worried about outside influences in the art, because some Hopi people had already been exposed to Euro-American styles of art making when they were sent to Protestant or Catholic boarding schools. Crescencio Martinez is one such artist who had been trained in these Western ways. 15 years after these unassuming beginnings, people started to realize that at this point a new kind of artwork was developing among Pueblo people. What began as an ethnographic assignment turned into a kind of stylization that came to codify what would be considered authentic Native American artwork well into the 50s. In 1902, a veteran teacher came to San Ildefonso to open a day school. Her name was Esther Hoyt. 18 children attended Hoyt's one-room schoolhouse, including future trailblazing artists Donita Peña, who's shown here, Alfredo Montoya, and Awat Sira, just to name a few. Julian Martinez, who later painted pots with his wife Maria Martinez, was also part of this first wave of Puebloan painters who developed an early style of easel painting. And I say this in quotes because most of the paintings were actually watercolors on paper. And while there was a long history of painting in these communities, it was primarily done on pots or in service of the community in some other way, and not on 2D substrates. These paintings on paper soon gleaned appreciation from modernists who were living and working in Santa Fe for part of the year. These modernist patrons, both collectors and artists, perceived the work by these artists as possessing a kind of naivete they admired. Additionally, because these mostly East Coast residents were so disenchanted with the rapid pace of industrialization and the accompanying isolation, they gravitated toward the Pueblo artists who were perceived as having maintained a oneness with the world around them. The visitors projected their desire for utopia onto the Pueblo peoples and their arts. The coherence of the Pueblo world and its corporate nature were greatly admired by Euro-American collectors. Their respect for what they perceived to be the harmonious oneness of Pueblo life, including also harmony with nature, was a prime motivator of their patronage of the new painting tradition. Furthermore, Inculcated in this patronage was the need to save the Indian in a world that had left him disenfranchised. This white savior mentality was an additional motivator for early patrons and promoters in their beginning efforts to draw awareness of Pueblo art to a broader public. The success of our exhibition cannot fail to better the economic condition of the living Indian artist and have a beneficial effect on their morale. Amelia Elizabeth White, a New York socialite, along with others, including the artist John Sloan, were early supporters of and advocates for the art of Pueblo people, even creating the Exposición of Indian Tribal Arts, a traveling exhibition that was first held in the Grand Central Galleries in 1931, before traveling around the country with 100 of the paintings showing in the Venice Biennale in about 1933. I think it's important to let you know that this early exploration into art as an individual, ego-based pursuit changed some of the social structures of the Pueblos, and it did not come without some tensions. Art that was created outside the social construct was deemed selfish and caused rifts among traditional community members and the aspiring artists. Additionally, conflicts arose over what things were appropriate to show non-Pueblo audiences. Furthermore, there became new factions of outside collectors who believed the art should remain purely Indian. But for them, that meant never evolving and remaining squarely within the realm of the ethnographic. I'm pointing this out to return to my earlier point regarding this idea of ironic duality. Embedded in the desire to experience the utopian through the Pueblo artists, the outside interlopers disrupted the lifeways that had made it possible. As is the nature of artistic practices, artists are continually pursuing new ways to make and to approach their work, and Pueblo artists were no different. The first phase, Pueblo artists, whom I have just described, were firmly planted in their ethnographic backgrounds. This kind of painting became somewhat codified by the opening of the studio at the Santa Fe Indian School, which was run by Dorothy Dunn, who had felt that if Native students were to learn painting, the work should remain, again, truly Indian. For her, that meant there was no need for Native artists to explore perspectival drawing and painting. There was no need for them to add shading, highlighting, or dimensionality to their work, but rather to keep the images flattened, and Native artists should only use natural pigments. So there was no need for color theory. Additionally, she did not want them to borrow motifs or ideas from other Native tribes. But despite these restrictions, and with the help of some enthusiastic supporters with their own agendas, Native artists from the Southwest created a second phase of Pueblo painting that held greater variety in style and subject matter, as more artists became active in painting and more patrons requested greater diversity of subject matter. Fred Cabote, Valino Shihei Herrera fell into this camp, along with Aqua P. And that's Fred Cabote, shown there. The third phase of Puebloan art was markedly different in form, contact, and in motivation of the artists. Many of these works featured geometric and abstract emblems taken from Pueblo pottery motifs and combining them with realistic human and animal representations. In these later years of the high point in Pueblo-style painting, we now begin to see new actors on the scene, like René Darnancourt, who championed Native American art as a part of the modernist movement. He advocated for a purely artistic interpretation of the work and encouraged looking at and appreciating it for its aesthetic qualities alone. His efforts were backed and supported by the Rockefellers. Now I'm returning to the exposition of the Indian tribal arts in 1931, which I mentioned earlier. This exhibition was also supported by Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Jr., and the catalog was written by John Sloan and Oliver Lafarge, who billed the exhibit as the first time Native art had been selected entirely with consideration of aesthetic value. When this exhibition toured Europe and the United States, it won rave reviews and led to the touting of the American wave of art, based largely upon the centuries-long practices of Native people. Again, the ironic duality of the term modernism being applied to ways of making hundreds and thousands of years old, especially in the motifs. Sloan doubled down on this connection, utilizing this show to not only bring Native artists into the fold of Euro-American artists, but to promote a new and completely separate form of American art, disentangled from that of its European predecessors. The Indian artist deserves to be classed as a modernist. His art is old, yet alive and dynamic. But his modernism is an expression of a continuing vigor. He is a natural symbolist. He is bold and versatile in the use of line and color. Indian painting is at once classic and modern. In 1939, René Darnoncourt organized an exhibition for the Golden Gate International Exposition in conjunction with the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, the Department of the Interior, and the Federal Art Project of the WPA. The Rockefeller Foundation again supported the initiative. The aim behind the exhibition again had a kind of savior bent to it, as Darnoncourt hoped to provide the living Indian a chance to find a new market for his products. As had now become the norm, there was space allocated where Native people could demonstrate their skill and welcome visitors, offering them first-hand views on everything from sand painting to house post carving. So in full disclosure, one of our previous directors, not our director, but the director of Native Arts at the Denver Art Museum, was also a huge supporter of Native contemporary art and worked very closely with Darnoncourt. We currently have a work in our collection that was carved in this same space during the exhibition, which is what you're seeing here. In the exhibition, Darnoncourt set up an experiment wherein there were 2 rooms where visitors could purchase Native art. One was a more contextual display with the work being seen in indigenous community sets, while the second showed the work in what was considered a gift shop type setting, designed in the modernist style of white on white with clean installations. The objective was to show how well Native arts could fit into a modern home, and apparently the public agreed, because the sales were far greater behind door number 2. This new way of selling Native art and the exposition itself influenced how Native art would be seen and connected to the modernist movement for decades to come. Here, Darnoncourt connected Native works of art to modern art, primitive art, and even surrealist art, all popular movements of the time. Ironically, modernism was ushered in through the highlighting of the work of Native people and the motifs that had been used for centuries. In 1941, René Darnoncourt and Frederick Douglass riffed off their success in San Francisco to bring a groundbreaking exhibition of Native art to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Together, they co-authored the book, Indian Art of the United States, and the exhibition displayed Native art in a non-ethnographic, sterile museum environment to focus visitors' full attention on the aesthetic quality of the art and to help them visualize how Native art could be collected for a Euro-American home. With World War II in full swing, Darnoncourt leaned heavily into a patriotic angle of Indigenous art, calling the art of Native people the most American of any we have in this country, with the hopes of growing the status of Native modern art to a broad audience home and away. In fact, the work of Native people came to support everything from the political leanings of Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote the foreword for the catalog, in which she designated Native people as a resource for America, and it also legitimized fledgling abstract expressionists such as Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, and Adolf Gottlieb. Some of these words are really tongue twisters, I was just gonna say. There is an answer in these works to all those who assume that modern abstract art is the esoteric exercise of a snobbish elite. For among these simple people, abstract art was the normal, well-understood, dominant tradition. Well, the San Francisco exhibition of 1939 and the MoMA exhibition of 1941 inspired Western audiences. It also fed the imagination of the indigenous artists, especially those who longed to step together with the West into modernism. Lloyd New, some of you will know him as Lloyd Kiva New, is one such artist who advocated for freedom in creating for Native artists. We had a tendency in our radical way to label all the art school movements for Native people as being more or less dedicated to the preservation of art forms rather than trying to find out what art forms might suit the dynamics of Indian culture. New went on to add that he was more interested in projecting Native arts into the future than binding the artist to specific materials, patterns, or ways of making. Together with Charles Lolema, they advocated for a small school for Indian arts to Charles B. Foss, then Director of Humanities for the Rockefeller Foundation. Their hope was that such a school could become a nucleus for substantial development. Foss was already worried about the state of Native American art, especially in the Southwest, after he discovered that the University of Arizona, who was funded by the Rockefellers, paid almost no attention to the art of Native American people, despite the large population in the state. Early attempts by the University of Arizona to rectify the situation fell flat, almost costing them their financial support. However, Renee Darnancourt again became involved as a liaison between the Rockefellers and the university. At that time, Darnancourt served as the director of the Museum of Modern Art. He was the chair of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. He was the vice president of the Nelson Rockefeller's Museum of Primitive Art, and he was the first president of the Association on American Indian Affairs. I got so exhausted just reading all of those things that he was doing. I'm really not sure how he could do them. I think there were women involved, that's my guess. Anyway, in 1959, a conference was planned entitled The Directions in Indian Art, and it was Darnancourt who helped secure funding for the endeavor and probably also influenced the direction for the conference. Lloyd New and Charles Lolema developed the agenda with tweaking that occurred by Foss. But it was agreed that the emphasis would be on, 1, the education of the public for the appreciation of Native art, 2, the betterment of economic conditions for Native artists, and 3, opportunities for Native artists as they transitioned away from the traditional and into the modern. In the funny way that this idea of ironic duality keeps showing up in this paper, of the 50 attendants meeting to decide the future of Native art, only 9 were Native. And, as is human nature, disagreements ensued. On being that while Native artists had been elevated, here's one of the arguments. I can't even read my own writing. One of the arguments was that while Native artists had been elevated, this elevation had created markets for more ethnographic materials and not new forms of artwork which had been hoped. There were also discussions about the infiltration of foreign-made objects being touted as authentic Native-made pieces, and of course, because there was an economic aspect to the conference, there were ideas of how to save the Indian tossed about. Lloyd New, who was of Cherokee descent, proclaimed, "Let's stop looking backward for our standards of Indian art production. We must admit that the heyday of Indian life is past or passing." Charles Lolema, who was Hopi, encouraged Native artists to expand on previous knowledge to find newer ways of doing things, citing that there was craft work all over the world and that Native artists need to be less concerned with tradition than simply creating works which a buyer could not resist. And Royal B. Hasrick, he's not pictured here, it was a non-Native author that wrote Native American-focused fiction, but he also worked at the Denver Art Museum, and he stated that the pitfalls of Indian craft production lay in great part to the failure to understand changes of public whim and adapt accordingly. It was important to interweave the native arts with abstract expressionism because many surrealists by this time had returned to Europe, and the Rockefellers and Darnancourt had a lot invested in making sure the tenets of modernism continued in the US. Part of those tenets was an underpinning of fierce individualism, which soon became confused and conflated with democracy itself. As you can tell by the remarks I just listed, Native artists and their fate were not immune to these conflations, and the idea that Native arts must become disentangled from tribalization became an important talking point, with many agreeing that Native arts had no future unless the relationship between the artist and their community was severed. Never going to happen. It is important for the Indian to realize that being an artist is a matter of being an individual. It seems to me that the real problem the Indian artist faces is the insistence that he be an Indian. The scapegoat for these conversations quickly became the Santa Fe Indian School and Dorothy Dunn's studio style of painting, which, as you may recall, had very specific parameters. During its reign, many important artists had come out of the school, such as Pablita Velarde, Jose Ray Toledo, Oscar Howe, and Fred Cabote, to name a few. Even after Dunn's retirement, the program continued for another 25 years, with important shows from the students traveling to the Musée d'Ethnographie at Trocadero in Paris. Foreign dignitaries visited the school, and many artists participated in WPA projects and national exhibitions. Still, at this conference, the future of the Santa Fe Indian School and the studio came under close scrutiny, with questions of their ability to serve the new Native artists hanging in the air. After this conference, the Rockefellers supported the Southwestern Indian Art Project, with funding going to the University of Arizona. The money would help Lloyd New undertake his vision of what Indian art education could look like through a series of summer seminars. However, concurrently, the Bureau of Indian Affairs opened the Institute of American Indian Art in Santa Fe, which replaced the Santa Fe Indian School. Over time, and not without struggle, it became clear that the IAIA had become the leader in Native American art education, a fact that remains true to this day. Some of the most important names in Indigenous art had their start at the IAIA, including T.C. Cannon, whom you saw earlier, Alan Hauser, Joy Harjo, Chanupa Hanska Luger, Gianni Whitehawk, and Rose Simpson, to name a few. And Chanupa and Rose are currently showing at the Whitney Biennial. What a strange, complicated, and circuitous route we have taken as we explored the relationship of Native people and artists to the world of modern art. I feel like I just went on a long journey to New York and then to Santa Fe, and now I'm back again. But before I wrap up my talk, I want to return one more time to this question of, are we the art or are we the artist? And the ironic duality embedded in the Native artist's identity. And I'm going to do that by exploring Jeffrey Gibson and his recent opening at the Venice Biennale. Jeffrey Gibson is the first Native American artist to represent the United States in their pavilion. Every Native artist and scholar, myself included, is very proud of him and very proud to see one of our own holding the main stage at such an important and world-renowned event. We have come a long way from this to this. And Gibson stands on the shoulders of a lot of artists who worked and struggled and fought to have him there. But my question to you is, have we also come a long way from this? And so I'm going to ask the gentleman in the back to play a film clip for me. I'll let this go for about a minute. If you're not used to Native music, it can be very loud. with all the advances, all the respect, all the new materiality involved in our practices, performing our indigeneity for non-natives is still required, either by them or maybe by us, because we have to continue to show that we are here and we are relevant. I think most of us struggle with this fine line between educating and performing, advocating or entertaining. Having to break down those stereotypes and undertake those diplomatic efforts to promote understanding and appreciation and to continue to justify our existence as people groups with as many rights as anyone else is still a very real thing. We are proud to be where we are today. I was proud to see our performers in Venice, and I feel immense pride when I see Native people dressed in their regalia, and when I hear our drums ring out in previously unimagined places. Excuse me. But I still, after the opening of Gibson's exhibition at the Biennale, have to question if even today, are we still expected to be the art, or are we finally free to be the artist? Thank you. Woo. Did I talk that long? Sorry, guys. Did I cry that long? Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Adolfo, for asking such a nice, easy question that I can answer super quickly. Could everybody over here hear it? This is like the struggle of our contemporary artists. And I will say, I'm going to give you like a philosophical answer. And it's just, it can only come from my heart because, of course, I can't speak for all Native people. But first of all, these young artists aren't the first to experience that. As artists like Jean Quick-to-See Smith or George Morrison entered the market, they felt obligated, Fritz Scholder, to deny their indigeneity in order to make it. So this has been a long, these people in the Pueblos were working in the 10s and the 20s and the 30s, right? This has been an ongoing struggle for Native people. And I think, again, my personal philosophy is that this is a false binary. The only, the thing is that when we feel that our art is not enough and that we have to give up this to get this prize, it just shows that racism is it's still in its full power, because otherwise people would be treated equally. So in a strange way, we have to find our other options outside of this binary, which is, some artists like Andrea Carlson, she's contemporary, but she also strongly feels that, And the thing is, like, if we give that up, we're saying it's not as good as anything else. And I reject that with the fiber of my being. The shame is that young artists still feel that. So how do we offer them additional options? Because that's just a false binary, in my opinion.
Anyone else? Thank you so much, Dakota.
Well, of course it's not, right? And it can't be, because artists are constantly in conversation with their past, not their past, with the past. And what you see, I think, with someone like Bryce is he's so literate in his knowledge of what preceded him that is embedded in every stroke he makes. His references, he comes out of Rauschenberg's studio. So there's a dimension of him that, of course, channels Rauschenberg. He's aware of Johns and the whole notion of encaustic painting. He's aware of Pollock and fields of painting. He's aware of Chinese traditions and other visual languages. So what makes that modern? What makes it modern, right?
This is a wonderful note on which to wrap up. Could we have the final image, please? Because with Frank dead, it's not tragic, but he had a wonderful, incredibly creative life.
Long,
He's lived to
long.
86, and
7.
Don't
sell him short a year.
Yeah, well, you know what I mean. It's typical to say he's very sad or something like that, but it's natural, And Larry, fortunately, Larry Poons there is still with us. And the last time I spoke at MoMA at a dinner last October, Larry Poons was the subject of honor in fundraising for the Art Students League. And the interesting thing about Larry is that not just at 86 or 87, he's still full of energy, like a sort of perpetual motorbike racer. Even if he doesn't still race motorbikes, or Frank Stella with the Snakes and Ladders, which are based on racetracks partly, It may be that we have to go back to the past, and the thing that Larry's gone back to, I'm going to copyright this because I'm going to do a show, come hell or high water, is the Baroque. And the Baroque has come back in fashion, become almost a period style of flowers, clouds, all glitter. All of that's come back. Cosmologies come back the same but different in the 21st century. So I think we end on a note of agreement. And the reason this old man has this man's book, he was the greatest living Shakespearean of his time. This is my Bible. I bought this in 73. But the thing is, it's about how human beings and perforce artists make sense of a senseless world by creating art and fiction of beginnings, middles, and ends, where in fact there's just flux. And that's, moments keep moving. I mean, it will have its critics, but it will always be the backbone of modernism. No matter how many times modernism dies, MoMA's going to resurrect it in one form or another. That's how I see it. That's why I want to go there when all this is done and have a good look around.
Well, I'm reminded of a Frank Stella story, which has to do with our efforts in 2000 to mark the millennial. And we wanted to, in a way, unlearn what we had learned to do so well in the 70s and 80s, which was to tell a very singular story about modern art. So we gathered everyone together on the curatorial staff, and instead of working by departments, we worked across departments. Instead of working, through a kind of clear chronology, we worked through a set of thematic ideas. Instead of never commissioning artists, we actually commissioned a number of artists to intervene and interact with us, including Michael Craig Martin. And I will never forget, Frank walked in to, Michael Craig Martin had done a series of kind of high-intensity pop images across our, I think it was our second floor lobby, on which we had installed paintings. Frank walked in and he got so angry.
Really?
I mean, furious,
Yes, I remember,
not angry,
yes.
viscerally angry, because this was a travesty to the modernism he understood. And in fact, for years, we were criticized by lots of critics and colleagues for having transgressed the story we were supposed to have told. But in fact, we were never supposed to tell a story, and during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we told multiple stories all the time because we were trying to figure it out. It was only in the 70s and 80s that there was an attempt to say, but this is the one and true story you need to know. And of course, the whole gambit in 2000 was to undo that so that we could continue to expand the ways in which we talk. And the moment for me, because you brought up John Elderfield, who was a brilliant curator, is a brilliant curator, but for many years was a brilliant curator at MoMA, first as the chief curator of drawings and a chief curator at large, and then ultimately the chief curator of painting and sculpture. John put a Renke Dijkstra photograph of a bather next to Cézanne's bather, both the same size, both studio portraits or studio images, and it was seen as a travesty that photography could be put in the same place as painting. And we look at that today and we go, really? We have a problem with that? But that was 24 years ago. We created a meltdown. And John's brilliance in all of this was they were next to each other on a wall, and when you turned, one was on a baffle, and one was on a wall adjacent to the baffle, so it was an L, not a... When you turned the corner and went around the baffle, was a tiny little photograph, and it was the studio photograph from which Cézanne's painter was painted. So, all of these supposed hierarchies have to be completely and always reconsidered.
True. And on our birthdays in 2000, we did a public conversation at the Royal Institution in London. And I thought I'd prepare, something like this. Frank was going to say what he was going to say. And he started with precisely what you said. And the last thing I'm going to add is that every heretic needs their pope, and every Bond needs their Goldfinger. And the day that MoMA ceases to become something to argue with, you will really know that modernism has run out of steam.
Quite right.
And we haven't. Thank you very much, Ben.
Am I say this as a dealer primarily in 19th and early 20th century American art, but and I know you've alluded to this, but wouldn't you agree every era throughout the history of time has its modernists, and they dissipate and they disappear, and it's only through art historical perspective that we can see them again after they're gone and after their perspective is.
Yeah, no, that's true. And you know, the battle between the ancients and the moderns was an English thing in the 18th century.
It was a Greek thing in the 3rd century BC. I mean, you know, start with the obvious. Every artist is contemporary. Every artist lives in the moment in which he or she lives. They're not thinking, oh my God, I'm an old master, or I'm a Baroque painter, right? They live in their moment. So what is it that makes this moment different? I do think there are some differences. The self-referentiality, the quest to create new and different visual languages, the willingness to wrestle and demolish the past, to eat the past in order to create a future. I mean, there are some things that are different in the circa mid-19th to late 19th century than there are in the mid-18th century. But in fact, you're absolutely right. Every moment has its modern moment, its moment in which artists are seeking to do something new and different. And at times it seems dramatic and radical, and at other times it seems imperceptible.
And each of those niches have a group of artists who are pushing the envelope and pushing things forward and doing things differently and moving art forward.
And we tend to know that retrospectively, and we tend to know it through the eyes of artists. It's the artists of the present who look back and see something that we haven't noticed and are able to then call that forward in their own work that I think makes us realize that often overlooked artists, or artists no longer fashionable, had a lot to say. We just lost the ability to see it.
I'll be very quick. I like what you had to say, especially here being in Heritage Auctions with the backdrop of two-dimensional art. My question has to do with the present day and Google, artificial intelligence, and the ability to, I guess, utilize those technologies to amplify the art that's in front of you, meaning have it scan the art, look at the art, and look at everything else in the world and see comparisons. Because I'm a 3D artist, and I know that art can be created and it can be destroyed. But with the advent of modern technologies, you can utilize the technologies to create the art, and then even if it's destroyed, it can be replicated because of the technology. So my question to you is, are you using apps like Google and AI to, what's the word, not authenticate, but bring a certain authenticity to what the person is viewing in front of them? Make sense?
A good point. In a way, I think this vindicates part of your thesis that at the time, in the midst of things, modernism somehow sort of, seems to be the thing of a moment. But then I'm asking myself, look, one, we're in a post-capitalist age. And well, put it another way, it's a different kind of capitalism. It's in a sense, it's a kind of capitalism that Marx foretold, a kind of extreme monopoly capitalism. They're talking about the stock market becoming irrelevant because Apple, Google, Microsoft, and all that, they've got their own stock. And I asked myself, well, I also call it the post-human age. And that's very easily done because I can't get a live voice on the phone anymore. You know, so, and then there's Heathrow, it's got a very nice Terminal 5, it's got a nice robot that goes around picking up bits of paper. So, you know, question in my mind, there's no answer, but with a modernism in the post-human age. But that's precisely what the canonical modernists, take Siegfried Gideon, Space, Time and Architecture, classic book, you know, classic document of modern art. And he thinks the same then. We always like to think of ourselves living as commodes were for it as in the midst. And when we're in the midst, we want beginnings, middles, and ends to make sense of things. But I think that when the dust has settled, I'm going back to Heraclitus. All things are flowing. I think the leap from Heraclitus to Einstein is not so big.
No, less big actually than some of the links or the leaps from Einstein to Niels Bohr. Just think
Absolutely.
about that. Einstein himself couldn't come to grips with quantum theory, couldn't believe it, couldn't actually accept that a particle and a wave could be the same thing, but just at a different time. So we all are confronted by different modes of understanding. I think what's interesting with artificial intelligence, which has been around for a very long time, I mean, if you really think about it, it's just a far more sophisticated search engine. But every time you use, you know, Google or Waze, or you're effectively using the same systems that artificial intelligence uses, but now the massive capacity to use big data and mine it is different, and that gives you new possibilities. What I do think is you're never beyond. What I do think is you're never beyond the human. I don't agree with David. I don't believe that we're in a post-human condition. I think the operative term in artificial intelligence is artificial, not intelligence. And so I think what's interesting about us as a species is we keep flirting with our own demise, but we just haven't succeeded yet.
Very good point. And you know, you think about Picasso and Demoiselle being the sort of keystone. But then what does Picasso do in between the wars? The Rappel Lord goes back to Angles and all that. And then the further he goes into the 20th century, the further back he goes to Velázquez, Delacroix, all of that. So
He stays in Paris in the 1930s. To think about that. But there are all of these, there are a lot of different things going on.
Oh, it's extraordinary, because, you know, primitivism comes into this, a preference for the primitive. We're going to go back to zero. But don't forget, zero wasn't zero for the so-called primitives. It was the present. You know, time is the answer. I always think time's the answer, and just to muse for a moment, Einstein spent the last, I think, 30 years of his life looking for a unified field theory which would unite time, space, light, and gravity. And he never found it. And this is like, you know, modernism. We're never going to find a still center. We'll find shifting positions around a kind of locus. That's modernist vitality. Time for TEFF.
Mike, it's still a little factoid, so it's not a question. But Mark Rothko went to Portland, Oregon, and graduated from a high school, Lincoln High School, before I went off to Yale in 1921. And my son goes to Lincoln High School, and he'll graduate from the same school in 2025.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Leah Dorner. How are you? I just thinking about post-human, what you mentioned, and then the human, which is inescapable, that we're in our bodies, we're in our flesh, we live, we breathe, our hearts beat. And then the materiality of paint, of the physical objects, Glenn, that you care for at the MoMA. And then when you showed the Flaming June in relation to the Rothko, they don't only have a relationship in terms of color, but the drapery that also can become elided with the flesh, with the nakedness underneath the drapery, and then the kind of veiling or the canvas of that the Rothko is painted on. Is there something that you can, I have nothing to wrap this up with a bow, but is there something that you can address in terms of the body painting and the flesh and color?
Well, you know, Rothko, I mean, with the chapel, it's an attempt to go out of time. And I compared the chapel to Stonehenge. And Rothko said, about very extraordinary, he said he wanted the paintings to be as if you come upon them in a wood at night. And if they were there, they were. And if they were not, they weren't. Extraordinary statement, you know, but it goes back to something beyond painting. You know, after the chapel, I mean, this is after Dante's thesis, but after the chapel, the king's dead, but long live the king. And, you know, that's modernism again. And painting's gonna come back. The rock's gonna come back. Draftsmanship's already come back, and so it goes.
And we find ourselves in the midst of a wood.
Okay, everybody. So first off, thank you both for, I'll just take a Leighton-esque Rothko word, or word that I think is applicable to both, for a sumptuous and at the same time pure conversation. And we hope you will both come back. I have ideas, especially about cross-media, amongst other things, Glenn. And for everybody else, and of course for you if you can stay, we are going to have a private view of the sale. Tomorrow morning, we will start promptly at 9:30. So, well, actually, there's breakfast, which is arguably an inducement since armies usually go on their stomach. So, but we will start promptly, and I look forward to a chat over yogurt after one over a drink. So thank you all, and a wonderful day, and to the two of you, deepest sincere thanks. So great to have both of you here.
Thank you very much. You know, I actually enjoyed that. There you are.
The Hiram Powers America, for example. Yeah. And then, you know, it also, the construction of whiteness was a point I made in passing. It's also in the construction of the other. So, you know, it's been hard to do this show in part because we're trying to encourage people to maybe pay attention to race as mutable, unfixed, subjective, and yet we're living in a world where a U.S. Census has boxes, right? And so much of how we navigate the world is about how you've been misidentified or how you identify. And so trying to pay attention to how whiteness is being constructed is maybe something really slippery.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I did that. I was a co-curator of Color of Anxiety in the Henry Moore Institute in England.
Yes.
And I had to tell people, you know, there was mostly white sculptures. White is a color.
Yeah.
You know, so when talking about the color of anxiety, it's not just the black works in there, but white is a color, and we have to think about what that means. So it's kind of interesting, the way people respond.
Yeah. Thank you.
I am Swedish. But I am have my mom is Jewish and my father is an Eskimo. So you see, when people see me, they naturally assume that I am very white, I guess, which is not the case. And I was born and raised in Mombasa, Kenya. So I think it's such an important conversation to have because people always make assumptions about a lot of things and necessarily they're not true. So you can be white as snow and then you could still be very involved in one subject matter and a culture. And no, we did not have colonies, we know, so. We are not part of that, so yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm interested in this topic of antiquity and how it's both problematic in conveying ideas of, types and specificity. But at the same time, I thought it was interesting that the last piece you talked about, that sculpture about imagining Ethiopia, how it's both a source of inspiration. So I'm wondering how, in the exhibition, you're trying to straddle that line between antiquity being a source of inspiration and yet also being a source of problems.
Yeah, that is a complicated question. And in the section that looks at antiquity or classicism, there is also a work. There are two works in there that are representing black men, and and they're made in bronze. So again, these things kind of slip all over the place. I mean, even in Adrian's talk this morning, as we were looking at the influence of Africa, I think there's also the influence of the ancient world in what some of the artists are finding when they're in Europe, right? And there's this kind of hybridizing that's happening through the forms. It's so easy to try to make like a fast classification, right? The contemporary is going to get us somewhere. The historical is disastrous, and that's not the intention of the show. And I hope that people slow down and look for things within their context, within their own terms. But so too, antiquity, it's how we absorbed it through Winckelmann and the other thinkers of the 18th century who said, the whiter the figure, the more beautiful it is, right? So if this is the leading thinker on antiquity, then you have to ask, well, what happened to how we saw the classical past through the eyes of this 18th century thinker? But it can't just be one thing or the other ever. Yes.
Apologize, this is the last question.
Okay.
Hi.
Thank you.
Do you have any comment to offer about the Martin Luther King monument in Washington that was made out of white marble by a Chinese sculptor?
It's a modern sculpture. It represents our world of today, the technologies, the materials, and in some ways it's looking back at a classical past and using marble, which was always a choice for monuments that endure. So I don't have a critique of it, but I will say, it's given the same space, deferential space. We were trying to film something near there, and we couldn't get a permit because, like the Vietnam Memorial, appropriately, there is an insistence on library-like atmosphere, no public demonstrations. So I think the question isn't always like, what does the monument look like, or how did it get to be here, or what did the artists think, or what materials they used? But the thing about monuments is that we get to see what people do with it once it's in the world. So that's maybe where my focus is now on that monument. Thank you so much for these questions and your time.
There's a certain point where there's a generation that comes along where they're not going to engage with Southern blackness, like it's just the thing to avoid, like a third rail, and then it gets turned again. Because I'm thinking about like Jack Whitten's generation. When I was working on a show and tried to borrow things that were about a Southern experience, I was shut down completely by the Blue Chip Gallery, and they said the family didn't want him to be mixed up with the South.
Mixed
in
up with the
supersession, yeah. But then you have Robert Colescott, who's like going back and doing that kind of hokum and using caricature for different and so I'm just wondering if you feel like there are these generational kind of waves that happen throughout the second half of the 20th century where amongst black, I mean, nobody's a monolith, but these particular generations are like, we're really gonna distance ourselves from that, and then it becomes interesting again to kind of critique and turn it against itself.
That's interesting. I was working on an exhibition, and we had a Sam Gilliam in the show, and thank God, I was writing the catalog entries, and so was somebody else, and she wrote that Sam's, one of his pieces had patches, she related it to Southern quilt making traditions. And he called the Driscoll Center and cussed us out. It actually wasn't before the Driscoll Center, but he was extraordinarily mad. And he sent a fax, I think, to the gallery and said, I am not working you look at my patches and my squares and my blocks of color and you see black quilting traditions. This is not what I'm working. I'm working in squares and I'm working in colors. A lot of times abstract, like Witten maybe, who's thinking, why can't I use the language of abstraction to talk about that line or that color or these relationships and not relate it back to something that is dealing with my familial past? Why can't I be given the same leeway as some others? And I think that's more along that than maybe generational. I don't know, but I don't know, because I do think that even as much as like in this era when the urban was the thing, it also was important to write your history, and those histories are coming out of the South in this early era. And you know, we're gonna hear from Stuhlman, right? He's gonna be talking about, where are you here? Okay, didn't even recognize you, babe. It's gonna be talking about that a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's a lot to do with abstraction and a lot to do with personalities. You know, God love Sam Gilliam. He was really honest about how he felt about these things. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. And bon appetit.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for a wonderful morning. We have 1 hour precisely for lunch, which means please think like 54 minutes so that you are here, we can start. It is an exceptional afternoon, and just as we plug for everybody else, I'm gonna plug for us. Spread the word. We want to spill out into Park Avenue next year. So we welcome everybody. And thank you so much, Adrian, for a wonderful talk.